Do legendary weapons matter in Starfield, or are they overrated? Well, I've been back at the lab testing and analyzing all 33 weapon effects to give you the lowdown on what's hot and what's not. Many of these are underwhelming, downright terrible, or a buggy mess, while others are incredibly strong and make it possible to tear through even the toughest of foes. Like many skill descriptions in the game, weapon effects also suffer from the extremely vague descriptors of exactly how potent their effects really are, leaving you wondering, what the hell did these even do? It also doesn't help that the Starfield Wiki and many other supposedly reputable sources of information are completely inaccurate in many cases. Thankfully for you, I've run the numbers and have actual evidence of these effects in action. There's some wild stuff at the end, so make sure to stick around. Let's take a look at the results. To start, there are a few very important things to understand when it comes to weapon effects. The first being that there are actually 3 tiers to them, which we'll call the rare, epic, and legendary tier. On a legendary weapon, for example, you'll have 3 weapon effects, the first being a rare effect, the second being an epic, and the third being legendary. You will only ever get 1 effect from each tier on a weapon, which unfortunately limits the number of possible legendary weapon combinations quite a bit. Similarly, as you would expect from epic weapon drops, they only roll epic and rare effects, and rare weapons only rare. Additionally, not every weapon effect can be rolled on every weapon type, such as melee weapons being excluded from rolling the extended magazine effect, which is sensible. Now, I've spawned thousands, and I mean thousands of weapons just to see what kind of legendaries the game would spit out, and for guns it seems like all effects are fair game, though there are some combinations I've not been able to see naturally roll, like 1-inch punch on heavy weapons for example. I can't say with certainty whether that's RNG working against me or that certain combos are just not possible to roll, so let me know if you've ever seen one of those in the wild because I've manually created some and they're kind of insane. For testing to avoid multiple weapon effects acting at the same time or weapon mods, I've rigged up an arsenal of plain weapons that each bear 1 single effect for more reliable testing results. We're going to start with the rare effects and work our way to legendary, and I'll try to zip through the more clear-cut effects. Anti-personnel is first up today, and there's absolutely nothing special about it. It's just 10% more damage to humans. Since they are the most common enemy type you'll fight unless you do a lot of exploration, you'll actually get a decent amount of use out of it, but 10% is pretty underwhelming. Bashing is next to useless unless you're a weirdo and are trying to do some pistol whipping only playthrough. You get double gun bashing damage, but I mean 0 times 2 is still 0, so it may as well not be an effect. Alright, you can do a little bit of damage if you hit an enemy in the head, but let's be real, this is just a filler effect. Berserker is actually kind of cool and rewards players for having less defensive gear equipped. This is specifically tied to your physical damage resistance and not your EM or energy resistance. Above 250 DR, you'll have a 5% damage buff, but anything below that in increments of 50 DR, your damage will increase by 10% each time, all the way up to a 50% bonus when your DR is below 50. So if you want to be a lewd little breath-holding freak and go no suit, no helmet, no pants into the dark void of space, you'll be rewarded with a 50% damage bonus for your strange efforts. Being realistic though, you'll probably only get practical value out of this on planets where you can safely take off your gear, and even then you'll have to decide whether the damage resistance trade-off is worth the offensive bonuses. I honestly think it's a good effect though, as it encourages an alternative playstyle with real trade-offs, so good job on this one, Bethesda. Cornered is another risk-reward effect that's instead centered around keeping your health low to receive scaling damage boost the lower your health gets. For every 10% HP you lose, you gain 5% more damage, up to 50% when your health is below 10%, which is quite significant, although you can surely imagine that would be difficult to sustain, especially on higher difficulties. That said, you could probably sit comfortably at around 50% HP depending on what you're fighting, and still benefit from a solid 25% damage increase, which definitely isn't nothing, so it's not half bad as a rare effect either. Disassembler is another boring effect that only gives 20% damage bonus to robots. Anybody who's put a good few hours into Starfield knows that robots make up a very small percentage of the enemies you'll fight in the game, so this is a pretty ass effect barring the few instances, mostly on abandoned spaceships where robots are the primary enemy. Extended magazine is a simple effect that doubles your magazine size. It's extremely convenient to have on certain weapon types with low mag sizes, like the Coachman that normally only has 2 shots, and it's great for high rate of fire automatic weapons, or even weapons that pack more of a punch where the increased mag size becomes large enough to finish off a full combat encounter without forcing you to reload. It's a solid quality of life effect that indirectly increases your DPS. Exterminator is the final enemy type effect, but this time for aliens with a 30% damage bonus, which is not terrible if you're doing a lot of planetary exploration. Again, because this is exclusive to one enemy type, however, its general usefulness is diminished, but at least it's the highest number increase of the 3. It's fine overall. Furious is a pretty meh effect. After your first successful hit, you deal 5% additional damage, which stacks for every consecutive hit, up to 30% on the 6th hit. If you miss any shot, you will reset the cycle, so this is kind of ass as maintaining 100% accuracy is not necessarily easy for everyone, or even possible in some cases because of the accuracy system, and having to hit 6 shots before reaching max potential on this is quite a lot. I can't say I'd recommend this over most of the other rare effects. Instigating is a very strong effect on weapons that shoot a single powerful projectile like snipers or heavy launchers. The first instance of damage on a full health enemy deals double damage. However, this only counts the very first damage pop on a multi-shot weapon. So this is horrible on shotguns or high rate of fire, low per bullet damage weapons like microguns. So it's solid with the right weapon for opening up an engagement, but that's about it. Oxygenated is just another hold breath booster that halves your O2 consumption while scoped and holding your breath, similar to what you'd get from the sniper certification skill. It's certainly useful if you really need to hold your breath for an excessive amount of time to zero in on multiple targets, but you may as well just upgrade the sniper certification skill if you're planning on using scoped weapons extensively anyways. The final rare effect is one many of you have probably come across, and if you're like me, you groan when you see it. It's the goddamn Space-Adept effect. It's a classic weapon ruiner for most of us, where you get a generous 30% more damage while in space, but negative 15% damage while planetside. And we all know that time spent with boots on the ground is disproportionately higher than in space. So I personally think this effect is hot garbage, but maybe a few of you prefer to spend more time breathing recycled air and we'll get more use out of this. Our first epic effect is Corrosive, which is a reasonably useful effect that has an 8% chance to proc, where each individual damage instance counts as a chance to activate. So multi-shot weapons are very potent here, as we'll see with many of the other similarly designed effects too. You can only proc this effect once every 12 seconds, but that 12-second cooldown is specifically tied to that weapon, so you can theoretically swap between multiple weapons with the same effect and stack it. Corrosive instantly deals 15% max HP and energy damage, while also reducing physical and energy resistances by 35% for 6 seconds. Now, I won't get into the nitty-gritty of how damage resistance and armor penetration works, but the long and short of it is that armor penetration sources interact multiplicatively, meaning that the 75% armor penetration you can get from rank 4 in the armor penetration skill, and the 35% you get from one stack of Corrosive does not reduce damage to 0, but rather 16.3% of its original value. This means that Corrosive becomes decreasingly useful as you invest further in armor penetration skills or weapon mods like depleted uranium rounds or armor piercing rounds. That said, the instant max HP damage it does is still useful, and free armor pen is still a net increase to DPS, so it's not useless. It's pretty bad on low rate of fire weapons though, and the 12-second cooldown tied to the weapon itself is ridiculous game design in my opinion. I seriously question if this was intentionally done because Bethesda knew that it completely fucks up game performance anytime one of these effects activates. I've got a pretty powerful PC, and no matter what settings I run, anytime I proc an effect like this, my game stutters for at least a second, which is absurd. It just works, right? Crippling is a weird effect as it almost encourages behavior that's counterintuitive to conventional wisdom on dealing damage in shooters. When hitting a limb of an enemy, your next shot will deal 30% more damage, which you can stack repeatedly by shooting limbs only, but obviously just aiming for the head would naturally net you more damage since those hits always deal double damage. Why would you sacrifice DPS potential aiming for limbs? Now, I mean, you could alternate between limb to head, but that would still be worse net DPS. There is an argument that this could be more of a generosity effect that helps give some of your damage back for hitting limbs instead of more critical areas, but I generally think this is a dumb effect that is massively eclipsed by some of the other epic effects. So handloading is another one of these vaguely described effects that reads, volatile rounds are designed to pack a bigger punch, but aren't as stable and can fail on occasion. What the hell does that actually translate to, though, in terms of damage? So it looks like on the wiki they took a stab at this, saying that there are percentile chances for certain damage increases and decreases to take place, but I think that's complete bullshit because the numbers I've got from actual testing are all over the place and are definitely not in line with this. I've had shots range from more than 100% additional damage down to half damage and everything in between. It's simply not worth the effort to find an exact answer on what the probabilities of each outcome are here, but from some reasonably extensive testing, I can say that you definitely experience a net positive to damage that's probably somewhere around 15 to 25%. It's a decent effect overall that's really just a damage buff with a little more flavor than a flat number increase, which I think is fine. Hitman is very simple. You get 15% more damage while aiming, so if you use scoped weapons and are happy to ADS in general, this will be a nice small damage buff, but if you're a hip-firing gunslinger, then this will be next to useless. That's it. Incendiary is actually insanely strong against enemies with high HP pools and high damage resistance, as it will instantly pop 12% of their max HP when the effect procs, along with another 24% of their max HP over 4 seconds. This effect is just like Corrosive, where it seems to have about an 8% proc rate, and it is also gated by that 12-second cooldown, which kinda sucks. So you can actually see my game freezes just before an incendiary shot goes off, and I think I finally figured out what's causing it. Every time you shoot, the game decides whether the next shot will be imbued with the effect, and when this happens, it completely switches the ammo type of the gun, or even worse, the gun itself. This is what causes the freezing, which is the same as what so many people have experienced when equipping weapons with long names and lots of mods, or opening the scanner with them equipped. The patch that supposedly fixed this in late September did not work for everyone, and in fact created the bug for many people, including myself, who had never previously experienced it. So now that my weapon is imbued with that special ammo type, I can keep shooting the imbued shots until I actually hit an NPC with it. Once something is hit, if you experience this freezing bug, your game will freeze and then switch back to your original ammo type. It's wild that this is actually how it works, and this holds true for any of the effects that have this 12-second cooldown tied to it. Weirdness aside, Incendiary is pretty damn good for an epic effect and only becomes more useful as you fight stronger foes. Lacerate is yet another prime offender for inaccurate wiki description and vague effect explanation. On the wiki, it says that it's a bleed effect that lasts for 4 seconds, which is wrong, it lasts for 6 seconds, and it says that it has a 6% chance of proccing. Honestly, this whole percent proc chance on any of these effects we discuss is anyone's best guess, unless someone's actually found the code to confirm it, or you do a sample size with like 1,000+ bullets fired to validate this manually. From experience, it does feel like they all hover around 5 to 10% though, so this wiki entry probably is not too far off, but it still seems like whoever is entering this data is pulling numbers out of their ass for the most part, with limited testing being done. I still do appreciate it, however, as the majority of the simpler entries have been accurate. What the description fails to mention though is that this bleed effect actually does 30% max HP over those 6 seconds, and you can reapply the bleed at any time during the initial bleed, resetting this timer back up to the 6 seconds again, which is different from the effects like Corrosion and Incendiary, which have a fixed cooldown. This is very potent and works great on rapid fire or multi-shot weapons, though it won't work on robots as they obviously have no blood to bleed. Because you can reapply the bleed, this is probably one of the best epic effects, and again it becomes better as enemies get stronger, with the only drawbacks being that the bleed does take a while to deliver its full dosage of damage. Med theft is pretty clear cut, and it's not terrible, but it's also nothing special. You have a 5% chance to have enemies drop 2 med packs on death, and that's it. Maybe it's useful for a no shops, fully self-sufficient playthrough, but otherwise if you do a reasonable amount of scavenging, utilize cover efficiently while playing, and you buy med items from shops every so often, you should never be running out of med kits. I'd probably take more damage over this personally. Poison is very similar to our other damage over time effects, but this time we get a 30% max HP poisoning and energy damage over 10 seconds, as well as a 40% movement speed debuff. This comes with the same standard 12-second cooldown between reapplications and the 5 to 10% proc rate. 10 seconds is kind of a long time for an effect to work its magic, but I guess the movement speed reduction could be useful against melee enemies. It's a bummer that this also can't be reapplied because of the cooldown, so it's not nearly as effective as it could be. Same as the others, it's best for multi-shot, high rate of fire weapons, and becomes more useful as enemies get stronger. Radioactive is more of the same with a slight variation. Now you get 24% max health damage over 6 seconds, but you can also demoralize the target, forcing them to run away from you, which can be useful in reducing the damage you take. Same cooldown, approximate proc rate, and use case, so nothing more to discuss here. Kind of sad that there's not much more variety between these effects. Our second last epic effect is Rapid, which increases attack speed by 25%. Now this is not really a 25% damage increase unless we're talking about melee weapons, as you'll also be reloading more often, so it's really just a worse version of a DPS booster, and it's almost just as boring. I guess it's kind of cool that you can fire the microgun a little faster than normal, but you're still going to be chewing through the same amount of ammo per damage. Pretty mid. Our final epic effect is Staggering, which was a bit of a weird one as it was hard to see if it was actually doing much of anything against regular humanoid enemies, but when I tested it against Terramorphs, it was pretty obvious it does work. There's about the same 5 to 10% chance to proc on any projectile hit, and when it takes effect, the enemy will be briefly staggered for just over a second, which could prove quite useful on higher difficulties for damage mitigation. You can't just focus fire and perma-stun an enemy, however, it seems like they must exit the staggered phase before hits will be able to proc the effect again. If you have more than enough damage to dish out against enemies already, I guess this could be a viable epic effect candidate, but it honestly barely felt like it was working on humanoids, and you need to be using a weapon with multi-hit or high rate of fire for it to be effective at all. We finally made it to legendary effects, and yet most of them are pretty underwhelming and I would argue are not even worthy of that title. We do have a couple that have earned their spot at the top though. We'll keep things alphabetical here and start with Concussive. This is almost identical to Staggering with about the same proc rate, only it has the ability to fully knock down enemies, which is immensely more powerful as it takes around 6 seconds for most enemies to pick themselves up, leaving them fully vulnerable to attacks, and more importantly, keeping you from taking damage. Again, if you've got enough damage to kill most enemies with these, this is actually not a bad option. There is a select type of encounter where this is actually incredibly annoying, however, and that's if an enemy has cover in front of them and you knock them down, you are probably not going to be able to hit them until they get back up, which is frustrating. Next we have Demoralizing, which we've seen in effect as part of the Radioactive effect, and it's kind of sad that this is a legendary effect. Sure, it's nice that you can force enemies to run away, making them deal no damage to you, but it's also kind of a pain in the ass having to chase them down to finish them off. I'd say it's just a worse version of Concussive since they have what seems to be an identical proc rate, only I have a perfect sitting duck to fire at with Concussive. Elemental is just a roulette effect with the chance to dish out any of Corrosive, Radiation, Poison, and Incendiary instead of just one of them. This still suffers from the same 12-second cooldown, however, which is a massive shame. You can find weapons with Elemental and one of these epic effects on it though, which can make for a seriously strong weapon when the effects both proc at the same time. Additionally, when firing high projectile count multi-shot weapons, there's a very small chance that you can proc multiple of these effects at the same time. I'm pretty sure that this wasn't actually intended behavior, this is just the result of how the effect actually works. So it's definitely the most potent on mag pulses and non-slug shotguns. In any case, Elemental is only as strong as the average potency of these 4 effects, so it's strong, but it's still held back by cooldowns, which is lame. Explosive is really bad, and it's probably one of the absolute worst effects in the game. All it does is provide a chance for every shot to be an explosive round, but that explosive round does peanut damage, so it's just complete shit. I don't know how anyone thought this should be a legendary effect because it's embarrassingly useless and just wastes a slot for something that could have been really unique and interesting. Frenzy, I guess, is a slightly better version of Demoralizing in some cases, as it will instead force the affected enemy to attack other enemies, just like the social tree equivalent skill Instigation does. Now, this doesn't always work, and they'll often still keep attacking you if you're too close to them, and it doesn't work at all if they're the only enemy around, so its usefulness is quite limited because of this. Just another lackluster legendary effect that's a lazy rehash of something that already exists in the skill. Shattering, on the other hand, is surprisingly good, albeit nothing exciting. You get a 15% damage increase, but you also get 30% armor penetration against all resistances, which is pretty solid. As we know, this acts multiplicatively with other sources of armor penetration, so its effectiveness diminishes as you have more AP sources, but this is still a solid effect overall that can help push you closer to dealing true damage to more resistant enemies. Now, I will say I've had an isolated case where Shattering does not work properly, and it seems like it doesn't apply the armor penetration effect at all. This is only against a level 94 Terramorph, and this is the only test where it's not worked correctly. It's worked normally against everything else, so take that with a grain of salt. There might be some issues with it, but it's very rare. Skip shot is also clear cut. You simply fire a second projectile every 4th shot, effectively increasing your DPS by 25%. This works with heavy weapon launchers as well as multi-shot weapons, which is cool. Nothing much more to say here. It's decent, but nothing special by any means. So Tesla is a pretty interesting effect that hurls electric vehicles at your enemies every 5 shots. Hold on, that's not right. Sorry, it creates an electric explosion that deals 4.5% max health damage over 4 seconds. The proc rate is also quite high and has got to be close to about 20%. What's different about Tesla is that not only can you reapply the effect without a cooldown, but it's also not based on the number of projectiles fired, but instead just whether a shot is fired or not. Because of this, it ends up making multi-shot weapons apply the Tesla effect to every single projectile fired in a single shot, and the game will stack all of them at the same time. Normally, it would just reset the damage counter, but for example, if you fired a mag pulse, which fires 7 projectiles per shot, it would actually end up shredding 31.5% max HP off the target instead. So for multi-shot weapons, Tesla is pretty solid, and otherwise it's a nifty little damage bonus that you can continuously reapply. Second to last on our list is titanium. All this effect does is reduce the base weight of the weapon it's applied to, which I guess is neat for making microguns weigh next to nothing. An important note is that this only applies to the base weight, and all added weapon mods will still be full weight, which I've seen cause confusion for some people around how the effect works. Nothing game changing here, and I'd take a cooler offensive effect over this. Speaking of which, we have saved the best for last, and that is 1-inch punch. This is absolutely bonkers and is so much fun and unlocks some ridiculous weapon combos. I'll only showcase a few here, as there's a whole other video I'll probably dedicate to the insanity that is 1-inch punch, but here are some powerful things you can do with it. The gist of the effect is that it quadruples the amount of projectiles per shot from the affected weapon, at the cost of halving the effective range and decreasing accuracy and rate of fire, which will vary based on the weapon. The net DPS increase in every instance is greater than the base, and it lets you do things like 1-inch punch or rapid firing equinox so that you can apply the rank 4 lasers burn almost as fast as a cutter, you can launch 4 rockets out of a bridger, or you can create an Omega Hornet's Nest coachman that generates so many explosions you'll have damage numbers flying out of the center of your screen for ages after every shot. If you get your hands on a decent weapon with 1-inch punch, I highly recommend giving it a try. We have now finally covered all 33 of the weapon effects, so let's do a quick summary of what effects you should be keeping your eyes out for in game. For rare effects, Berserker and Cornered are the most interesting, while Extended Mag is a nice to have, and Instigating can be useful with the right weapons. Everything else is whatever or situational. For epic effects, I'd say most are decent, with Med Theft, Hitman, and Staggering probably being the worst of the bunch, and Lacerate, Incendiary, and Corrosive being the best. For legendary effects, 1-inch punch is just godly, explosive is dogshit, and the rest have varying degrees of utility. I wish there were a few more interesting effects in this list, instead of half of them really being basic damage increases or essentially the same effect with a slightly different flavor, but at least some are pretty solid. That's all for today. Subscribe for more research-backed, no BS gaming content, hit up Patreon for early access to videos and other cool perks, and check out my analysis and tier list of the tech skills next if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.